The sterile smell of disinfectant still clung to my clothes 3 hours after leaving the hospital, a constant reminder of the battle we'd just won. I sat in the cramped confines of my Honda Civic, watching the sun set behind the medical center where my mother had spent the last 18 months fighting for her life. The parking garage echoed with the distant sounds of car doors slamming and engines starting, but I remained frozen in my seat, staring at the discharge papers folded in my lap. Thessaly Grimwald was officially cancer-free. The words should have filled me with joy, should have sent me racing home to celebrate, should have prompted phone calls to everyone who'd supported us through this nightmare. Instead, I felt hollow, scraped clean by a combination of exhaustion and something far more painful that I wasn't ready to name. My mother was alive, healthy, and ready to resume the life that cancer had interrupted. That should have been enough. That should have been everything, but it wasn't. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the messages that had been accumulating since we'd left Dr. Whitmore's office that morning. Congratulations from co-workers, relief from distant relatives, celebration emojis from friends who'd watched me struggle through every chemotherapy session, every radiation treatment, every sleepless night when the side effects kept my mother awake and crying. The support had been overwhelming at times, a network of people who understood what this victory meant. What struck me was how many of the messages assumed I'd been the primary caregiver. You must be so relieved, Marlo. Your dedication to your mother has been incredible. She's lucky to have a daughter like you. Message after message, acknowledging the reality that everyone outside our immediate family seemed to understand. I had been the one holding this family together while cancer tried to tear it apart. Everyone except my mother herself. The scene from this morning played on repeat in my mind as I finally started the car and began the 20-minute drive to the apartment I could barely afford. We'd been sitting in Dr. Whitmore's office, the three of us clustered around his desk while he explained the final test results. Clear margins, no evidence of remaining cancer cells, a recovery that exceeded even his most optimistic projections. My mother had cried tears of joy, her hands shaking as she processed the news that she was going to live. And then she'd turn to my sister. Venetia, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. You saved my life. Venetia had been there for exactly 4 of the 18 months. 4 months after I'd begged her to come help, after I'd explained that I was drowning trying to manage my mother's care while working 2 jobs to pay for the treatments her insurance wouldn't cover. She'd finally arrived from Portland with great fanfare, taking over my mother's care with the kind of effortless competence that made everyone forget I'd been managing alone for over a year. She'd reorganized my mother's medication schedule, which I'd apparently been doing incorrectly despite following doctor's orders to the letter. She'd redecorated the sick room to be more healing and positive, replacing the practical setup I'd created with flowing curtains and essential oil diffusers. She'd hired a nutritionist to plan meals that would boost my mother's immune system, meals that were remarkably similar to the foods I'd been preparing, but somehow more legitimate because they came with professional credentials. Most importantly, she'd been present for the final 3 chemotherapy sessions and the last 2 doctor's appointments. She'd held my mother's hand during the scan that revealed the cancer was gone. She'd been the one standing next to the hospital bed when Dr. Whitmore delivered the good news that ended our long nightmare. And so, in my mother's mind, Venetia had saved her life. The apartment complex where I'd been living for the past 8 months was a far cry from the house I'd owned before my mother's diagnosis. Generic beige buildings clustered around a parking lot that never seemed to have enough spaces, windows that looked out onto either the busy street or the dumpsters behind the complex. It was temporary housing, I'd told myself when I'd signed the lease, just until my mother was better and I could figure out how to rebuild what I'd lost. I climbed the stairs to my second-floor unit, fishing for keys in a purse that contained exactly $37 and a credit card that was maxed out at $12,000. The apartment was clean but sparse, furnished with items from thrift stores and whatever I'd managed to save when the bank foreclosed on my house. The house I'd owned outright before the cancer diagnosis. The house I'd mortgaged to pay for experimental treatments that insurance had deemed unnecessary. The foreclosure notice was still pinned to my refrigerator, not because I enjoyed torturing myself, but because it served as a reminder of what I'd been willing to sacrifice. $320,000 in equity, gone. My 2019 Subaru sold to a used car dealer for $8,000 to cover 2 months of medication costs. My retirement account emptied to pay for a specialist in Houston who'd pioneered a treatment protocol that had ultimately saved my mother's life. I'd calculated the total cost once, late at night when I couldn't sleep and the bills were scattered across my kitchen table like accusations. $473,000. That's what it had cost to keep my mother alive. Money that insurance had refused to cover because the treatments were too experimental, too risky, too expensive for someone her age. I'd paid it without hesitation. The irony was that I'd never expected gratitude. I'd never done any of it for recognition or acknowledgement. I'd done it because she was my mother, because I loved her, because the alternative was unthinkable. But standing in Dr. Whitmore's office that morning, listening to her thank Venetia for saving her life while I sat 3 feet away in a chair that I'd occupied for dozens of previous appointments, I'd felt something crack inside my chest. Not jealousy exactly, not anger, though that was certainly part of it. Something more complicated and painful, the realization that 18 months of sacrifice had been rendered invisible by 4 months of visible care. I heated up a frozen dinner and tried to focus on television, but my mind kept drifting to the phone call I needed to make. My landlord, Mr. Petrov, had been patient about the late rent, but patience had limits. The eviction notice had arrived 3 days ago, giving me 2 weeks to pay the $4,000 I owed or find somewhere else to live. I'd been hoping that my mother's recovery would somehow make it easier to ask for help, that the end of medical expenses would open up possibilities I hadn't been able to consider. But asking my mother for money felt impossible after watching her shower Venetia with gratitude for care that I'd been providing alone for over a year. And asking Venetia was out of the question. She'd made it clear during her 4-month stay that she considered my financial situation a result of poor planning rather than extraordinary circumstances. "You should have set up a GoFundMe," she'd said one evening, scrolling through her phone while I organized my mother's medications. "That's what smart people do when they face medical bills they can't afford." I'd explained that I'd tried crowdfunding early in my mother's treatment, that it had raised $1,800 from friends and coworkers, barely enough to cover 8 hour to single doctor's visit. She'd shrugged, already losing interest in the conversation. Well, you should have done more research. There are programs, foundations, resources for people in your situation. You just have to know where to look. The implication had been clear. My financial ruin was my own fault, the result of ignorance or incompetence rather than a healthcare system that bankrupted families facing serious illness. It was easier to blame me than to acknowledge that I'd been trying to save our mother's life with whatever resources I could scrape together. My phone rang at 9:30, startling me out of thoughts that were becoming increasingly dark. Venetia's name appeared on the screen, probably calling to share more details about our mother's recovery, to plan some kind of celebration that would center around her own contributions to the victory we were celebrating. Marlo, I just wanted to check in, see how you're processing everything from today. Her voice carried that particular tone of concern that she'd perfected during her 4 months as our mother's caregiver, the careful modulation of someone who'd learned to sound deeply invested in other people's emotional well-being. I'm fine, I said, which was true in the most technical sense. I was breathing, conscious, and capable of basic functions. It's wonderful news. I'm so relieved. Mom seems a little overwhelmed by everything. The reality of being cancer-free, the adjustment back to normal life. I think she's going to need ongoing support as she transitions. There it was, the assumption that Venetia would continue to be the primary source of that support, despite the fact that I'd been managing my mother's care long before my sister's arrival, and would presumably continue to do so after her inevitable departure. Are you planning to stay in town? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. For a few more weeks, probably. Mom and I have been talking about some changes she wants to make, ways to structure her life differently now that she's healthy. She's thinking about selling the house, maybe moving somewhere with better weather, somewhere closer to me. The words hit like a physical blow. My mother's house was the only constant in my life right now, the place where I went every few days to check on her, to help with tasks that were still difficult, to maintain the connection that had sustained me through 18 months of crisis. The idea that she might move away, might choose to be closer to Venetia instead of me, felt like another layer of abandonment I wasn't prepared to handle. Has she made any decisions? I managed to ask. Nothing definite yet, but she's excited about the possibility of a fresh start somewhere new. After everything she's been through, she deserves to make choices based on what will make her happiest, don't you think? I agreed, because what else could I do? We talked for a few more minutes about practical matters, about follow-up appointments and monitoring protocols, about the gradual return to normal life that we were all supposedly celebrating. When we hung up, I sat in my empty apartment and tried to process the conversation. My mother was not only failing to acknowledge my role in her recovery, she was actively planning a future that didn't include me. 18 months of sacrifice, financial ruin, and emotional exhaustion had earned me the right to be forgotten as soon as someone more appealing came along. I'd been naive to expect anything different. The eviction notice stared at me from the refrigerator door. Bright white paper against the beige surface, impossible to ignore. 2 weeks to find $4,000 or join the ranks of people whose financial desperation was visible to strangers. I'd driven past homeless encampments on my way to work, seen people living in cars and makeshift shelters, and always assumed that I was somehow protected from that reality by education, by family connections, by the invisible safety net that middle-class people believed would catch them if they fell. But safety nets had holes, and some falls were too far to survive intact. I spent the next 3 days applying for personal loans that I knew I wouldn't qualify for, reaching out to organizations that helped people facing eviction, exploring options that would let me stay housed while I figured out how to rebuild my life. The responses were uniformly disappointing. My credit score had been destroyed by missed payments during my mother's treatment. My income from the restaurant where I worked nights wasn't sufficient to qualify for most assistance programs. I made too much money to qualify for emergency aid, but not enough to actually survive. The calculations were brutally simple. I could afford either housing or food, utilities or transportation, but not the combination required for basic stability. And I'd reached the limit of what friends and extended family could provide. Everyone had been generous during my mother's crisis, contributing what they could to help with medical expenses, but charity had natural boundaries that I'd already pushed past. By Thursday morning, I'd accepted the reality that I was going to lose the apartment. The question was where I would go next, how I would manage the transition from housed to homeless without losing the job that provided my only income. My supervisor at Meridian Restaurant had been understanding about my irregular schedule during my mother's treatment, but patience had limits there too. I started researching options that felt humiliating to even consider. Shelters in the area, most of which had waiting lists and residency requirements that I didn't meet. Extended stay motels that rented rooms by the week, expensive and depressing, but potentially manageable for a few months. My car, which was reliable enough to serve as temporary housing if I could find safe places to park overnight. The cheapest option was a motel called the Starlight Inn, located next to a gas station on the outskirts of town. $79 per night, $450 per week if paid in advance. The math worked, barely, if I could pick up extra shifts and survive on the cheapest food possible. It wasn't a solution, but it was a bridge to something better, a way to avoid sleeping in my car while I figured out longer-term options. I called and made a reservation for the following Monday, the day after my lease officially expired. The woman who answered the phone sounded tired and bored, taking my information with the efficiency of someone who'd processed hundreds of similar reservations from people whose lives hadn't gone according to plan. Check-in is after 3 p.m. Payment in advance, cash or credit card. No refunds for early departure. The business transaction felt surreal, paying for housing that would cost more per month than my current apartment while providing a fraction of the space and amenities. But it was housing, and that was more than I would have if I did nothing. Friday brought a text from my mother, the first direct communication I'd received from her since the appointment with Dr. Whitmore. Marlo, could you come by this weekend? Venetia is helping me go through some things, and there are a few items I'd like you to have. The message felt ominous in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Going through things suggested preparation for the move that Venetia had mentioned, the fresh start that apparently required leaving behind not just possessions, but people who'd been part of the difficult years. I texted back that I'd come by Sunday afternoon after my lunch shift at the restaurant. The house I'd grown up in looked different when I arrived Sunday, boxes stacked in the hallway and furniture rearranged in ways that made familiar spaces feel foreign. Venetia answered the door with the bright smile she'd perfected during her stay, all warmth and enthusiasm and barely contained energy. "Marlo, perfect timing. Mom's been so excited about showing you the things she wants you to have." My mother appeared from the kitchen, looking healthier than she had in months, her color good and her energy restored. The transformation was remarkable, the difference between the frail woman who'd struggled through chemotherapy and the vibrant person standing before me now. Cancer had taken a lot from her, but not everything, and her recovery was genuinely miraculous. "Sweetheart, I'm so glad you're here. Come see what we've been doing." She led me through rooms that were being systematically dismantled, decades of accumulated possessions sorted into categories of keep, donate, and discard. The efficiency was impressive, the kind of thorough organizational project that my mother had always excelled at when she had the energy to focus. Venetia has been such a help with all of this. I never could have managed it alone. The comment stung, another casual dismissal of my availability and willingness to help with whatever she needed. I'd been coming by regularly throughout her treatment, managing household tasks that were beyond her energy level, but that assistance had apparently been invisible compared to the dramatic reorganization currently underway. "I wanted you to have these," my mother said, gesturing to a small collection of items arranged on the dining room table. Photo albums from my childhood, a jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother, a set of books that I'd loved as a teenager, sentimental items, meaningful but not valuable, the kind of things that parents passed on to adult children when they were preparing for major life changes. "Are you sure you want to get rid of all of this?" I asked, looking around at the systematic dismantling of the home where I'd grown up. "I'm not getting rid of it, honey. I'm just simplifying. Venetia's found this wonderful community in Portland, active senior housing with all kinds of amenities. It's exactly what I need for this next phase of my life." The decision had clearly been made, the move planned and organized without any input from me. My mother was leaving, relocating to be near the daughter who'd been present for the end of her cancer treatment rather than the one who'd been present for everything else. "When are you planning to move?" I asked. "Next month, probably. Venetia's found a moving company that specializes in long-distance relocations for seniors. They handle everything: packing, transportation, setting up the new place. It takes all the stress out of the process." The timeline meant she'd be gone before I figured out my own housing situation, before I'd had a chance to stabilize my life enough to maintain regular contact. The distance between our states was manageable for occasional visits, but not for the kind of ongoing relationship that had sustained us through her illness. I spent 2 hours looking through photo albums and listening to stories about the Portland community that would be my mother's new home. Venetia had researched everything thoroughly, touring facilities and interviewing staff and creating detailed comparisons of amenities and costs. Her competence was undeniable, her dedication to finding the perfect situation for our mother both admirable and painful to witness. When I left that afternoon, carrying a box of childhood mementos, I felt like I was saying goodbye to more than just possessions. The house would be sold to fund my mother's relocation. The physical space where our family had existed would belong to strangers, and the woman who'd raised me would build a new life 800 miles away. Monday morning arrived with the finality of an execution date. I packed everything I owned into my Honda Civic, surprised by how little space my entire life required when reduced to essentials. The apartment looked smaller and more depressing empty, just another anonymous unit ready for the next tenant who would hopefully have better luck maintaining stable housing. The Starlight Inn was everything I'd expected, and worse, a collection of single-story buildings arranged around a parking lot that specialized in hosting people whose circumstances had become desperate. My room was clean but worn, furnished with items that had seen decades of temporary residence, decorated in colors that had probably been cheerful in 1987. The view from my window was of the gas station next door, a constant stream of customers buying coffee and lottery tickets and the small necessities that sustained people in transit. At night, the neon signs created a harsh glow that made sleep difficult, but sleep had been elusive anyway since my mother's diagnosis, interrupted by anxiety and exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to cure. I'd been living at the Starlight for 6 days when the phone rang at 2:17 in the morning. The sound cut through the artificial quiet of the motel room like an alarm, jarring me from the restless half-sleep that had become my norm. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, a local area code, but otherwise unfamiliar. At 2:17 in the morning, phone calls meant emergencies, bad news, crises that couldn't wait for business hours. I answered on the fourth ring, my voice thick with sleep and confusion. "Hello? Miss Grimwald? This is Detective Rebecca Thornfield with the Metropolitan Police Department. I apologize for calling at this hour, but I need to speak with you about an urgent matter concerning your family." My heart hammered against my ribs as I sat up straighter on the motel bed, suddenly wide awake despite the early hour. Detective calls at 2:17 in the morning never brought good news, and my first thought was that something had happened to my mother during her recovery. "What kind of urgent matter?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "Ma'am, I'm calling about your sister, Venetia Grimwald. She was arrested approximately 3 hours ago on charges of elder fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement. During processing, she listed you as her emergency contact." The words didn't make sense at first, each one landing separately without connecting to form coherent meaning. Venetia arrested, fraud, elder abuse. My sister, who'd spent 4 months caring for our mother with what everyone had praised as exemplary dedication. "I think there's been a mistake," I said slowly. "My sister has been taking care of our mother during cancer treatment. She's not capable of the things you're describing." Detective Thornfield's sigh carried the weight of someone who'd delivered similar news many times before. "Miss Grimwald, I understand this is shocking. Would it be possible for you to come down to the station? There are some things we need to discuss, and frankly, you may be able to help us understand the full scope of what's been happening." I looked around the depressing motel room, at the clothes I'd thrown over the chair and the box of childhood, mementos that represented everything I had left. The idea of getting dressed and driving to a police station at this hour felt surreal, but the alternative was lying awake, wondering what my sister had done that warranted criminal charges. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, I told her. The police station was a low brick building downtown, fluorescent lit and institutional in the way that all government buildings seemed to be. Detective Thornfield met me in the lobby, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that suggested she'd seen enough human complexity to rarely be surprised by anything. "Thank you for coming, Miss Grimwald. I know this is difficult timing, but we've been investigating your sister's activities for several weeks, and tonight we finally had enough evidence to make an arrest." She led me to a small conference room and offered coffee that I desperately needed but was too nervous to drink. The folder she placed on the table between us was thick enough to suggest that whatever Venetia had done was extensive and well documented. "Before we begin, I need to ask you some questions about your family's financial situation during your mother's cancer treatment. Specifically, how those medical expenses were handled." I explained the basics: the insurance denials, the experimental treatments, the mounting costs that had eventually consumed my entire financial life. Detective Thornfield took notes, but didn't seem surprised by any of it, as if she'd already heard similar information from other sources. "And your sister arrived when, during this process?" "About 4 months ago. She came from Portland to help with Mom's care when I asked her to. The medical bills were becoming overwhelming, and I was working 2 jobs while trying to manage doctor's appointments and treatments." Detective Thornfield nodded and opened the folder. "Miss Grimwald, what I'm about to show you may be upsetting. We discovered these documents during our investigation into your sister's financial activities." The first page was a copy of an insurance claim form that I'd never seen before, dated 2 months after Venetia's arrival. It listed treatments and procedures that I knew my mother had received, but the billing was structured differently than any of the forms I'd been dealing with. Instead of the denials I'd grown accustomed to, this claim showed approved coverage for nearly $200,000 in experimental treatments. "I don't understand," I said, staring at the document. "The insurance company told us repeatedly that these treatments weren't covered. We appealed multiple times and were denied every time." "That's because your sister filed these claims under a different policy," Detective Thornfield explained. "She obtained your mother's personal information and applied for supplemental coverage through a program designed for low-income cancer patients. The coverage was approved, and payments were sent directly to an account that your sister controlled." The room seemed to shift around me as the implications became clear. "You're saying the treatments were covered, that there was insurance money available that I didn't know about? Not just available, Miss Grimwald, paid out, to the tune of approximately $420,000 over the past 4 months." I stared at the papers, trying to process information that contradicted everything I'd understood about our financial situation. While I'd been emptying my retirement account and losing my house to foreclosure, there had been insurance money, substantial insurance money, that was being diverted to accounts I didn't know existed. "Where did the money go?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect the answer. Detective Thornfield pulled out bank statements that showed deposits matching the insurance payouts, followed immediately by transfers to accounts in Venetia's name. "Your sister was systematically stealing the insurance payments while allowing you to believe that the treatments weren't covered. She watched you sacrifice your home, your savings, your entire financial future, while she collected nearly $500,000 that should have been used for your mother's care." The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that it left me speechless. Venetia hadn't just failed to help during my mother's crisis, she'd actively profited from it while watching me destroy my life to pay for treatments that insurance was actually covering. But the treatments were paid for, I said, grasping for some logic that would make this less monstrous. Mom got the care she needed. Because you paid for it, Detective Thornfield said gently. Your sister was collecting insurance money for treatments that you had already covered with your own funds. She was essentially being paid twice for the same medical expenses. I thought about the mortgage on my house, the sale of my car, the emptied retirement account. Every sacrifice I'd made had been unnecessary, the result of fraud that my own sister had orchestrated while positioning herself as the devoted daughter who'd saved our mother's life. There's more, Detective Thornfield continued. We found evidence that your sister has been involved in similar schemes with at least 3 other families over the past 2 years. She targets families dealing with serious medical crises, offers to help coordinate care, then systematically diverts insurance payments while allowing the families to exhaust their own resources. The systematic nature of it made me feel sick. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a desperate decision during a family crisis. This was a calculated pattern of abuse, targeting people when they were most vulnerable and least able to protect themselves. How did you find out? I asked. Anonymous tip 3 weeks ago from someone who suspected your sister wasn't who she claimed to be. When we started investigating, we discovered the false insurance applications, the diverted payments, and eventually the pattern of similar cases in other states. Anonymous tip. Someone had been watching Venetia closely enough to recognize that something wasn't right about her behavior during my mother's treatment. I wondered who had noticed what I'd been too exhausted and overwhelmed to see. What happens now? I asked. Your sister will be charged with multiple felonies related to fraud and elder abuse. The insurance companies will be notified about the false claims, and there will likely be civil proceedings to recover the stolen funds. As for you, she paused, consulting her notes. You'll need to document your financial losses during this period. There may be restitution available, though these cases can take time to resolve. Restitution. The possibility that I might recover some of what I'd lost felt almost too hopeful to consider. My house was gone, sold at foreclosure, but there might be other ways to rebuild what Venetia's fraud had destroyed. I'll need you to sign some paperwork acknowledging what we've discussed tonight, and we'll probably have follow-up questions as the investigation continues. Do you have any questions for me? I had dozens of questions, but most of them were about family dynamics and personal betrayal rather than legal procedures. Does my mother know? Detective Thornfield's expression softened slightly. We haven't contacted her yet. We wanted to speak with you first, since you were the primary victim of the financial fraud. How do you want to handle telling her? The question I'd been avoiding suddenly demanded an answer. My mother, who'd spent this morning planning her move to Portland to be closer to the daughter who'd supposedly saved her life, would need to learn that her devoted caregiver was actually a criminal who'd been systematically stealing from our family. I'll tell her, I said, but I need time to figure out how. Detective Thornfield gave me her business card and walked me back to the lobby where the early morning shift was beginning to arrive. The world outside looked the same as it had when I'd entered the station, but everything had changed in ways I was still trying to understand. I sat in my car in the police station parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the paperwork Detective Thornfield had given me. Bank statements showing the insurance payments that should have covered my mother's treatment, Documentation of the false applications that Venetia had filed using information she'd obtained while supposedly helping with our mother's care. Evidence of a betrayal so thorough that it had cost me everything while enriching the person I'd trusted to help during our family's crisis. The drive back to the Starlight Inn felt like traveling through a different world, one where the financial desperation I'd accepted as inevitable was actually the result of deliberate theft. The motel room that had felt like rock bottom suddenly seemed like a temporary inconvenience rather than permanent defeat. I called in sick to work and spent the morning researching everything Detective Thornfield had explained. The supplemental insurance program that Venetia had fraudulently accessed was real, designed specifically for families facing catastrophic medical expenses. I should have qualified for it 18 months ago, when my mother's cancer was first diagnosed. The coverage would have paid for every treatment she'd received, every medication she'd needed, every experimental therapy that had ultimately saved her life. Instead, I'd been told by my mother's regular insurance company that nothing was covered, that experimental treatments were too risky and expensive for someone her age. I'd accepted their denials and focused on finding other ways to pay, never thinking to research additional programs that might have been available. Venetia had known about the program from the beginning. Her research had been thorough, and her applications expertly crafted, using my mother's real medical information but diverting the payments to accounts that only she controlled. She'd watched me sacrifice everything I owned while collecting nearly $500,000 that should have prevented any financial hardship. The cruelest part was how she'd positioned herself as the competent sister who'd arrived to save the day. Every suggestion she'd made about my apparent mismanagement of my mother's care, every implication that my financial struggles were the result of poor planning, had been calculated manipulation designed to cover her own theft. I spent the afternoon documenting my financial losses as Detective Thornfield had requested. The house that had been foreclosed on, worth $320,000 in equity. The car I'd sold for $8,000. The retirement account I'd emptied, worth nearly $90,000. Various credit cards maxed out to pay for medical expenses, totaling another $35,000. The total was staggering when laid out systematically. $453,000 plus interest and penalties and fees associated with missed payments and foreclosure proceedings. Money that I'd lost while Venetia collected insurance payments that would have covered everything. But the financial loss, devastating as it was, felt secondary to the emotional betrayal. I'd spent 18 months believing that I was the only family member willing to sacrifice for my mother's care. I'd felt guilty about asking Venetia for help, assuming that her busy life in Portland made it difficult for her to contribute significantly to our crisis. When she'd finally arrived and taken over many caregiving responsibilities, I'd been grateful, despite the subtle criticisms of how I'd been managing things. Now I understood that her presence hadn't been about helping our mother. It had been about positioning herself to steal the insurance money while maintaining plausible deniability about my financial struggles. She'd needed to be physically present to maintain the fraud, to appear legitimately involved in our mother's care while collecting payments for it. The phone call I was dreading came that evening, just as I was trying to decide what to eat from the vending machine outside my motel room. My mother's number appeared on the screen, and I knew that Detective Thornfield had contacted her as promised. "Marlo? Honey, I just got the most confusing phone call from a police detective. She was saying things about Venetia that don't make any sense." My mother's voice carried the bewildered tone of someone whose reality had been fundamentally challenged. She'd spent 4 months viewing Venetia as her savior, the daughter who'd sacrificed time and energy to ensure her recovery. Learning that her devoted caregiver was actually a criminal who'd been stealing from our family would require rebuilding her entire understanding of the past year. "Mom, I need to come over so we can talk about this properly."
It's complicated, and you deserve to understand everything that's been happening. Is it true what the detective said about Venetia taking money that was supposed to pay for my treatment? The pain in her voice made my chest tighten. Yes, Mom.
"It's true. Venetia has been stealing from us while letting me pay for your care with my own money. But the important thing is that you got the treatment you needed, and you're healthy now." "Oh my God, Marlo, your house, your car, everything you lost, it was all unnecessary?" The conversation I'd been avoiding was finally happening, the moment when my mother would understand the true cost of Venetia's fraud. It was unnecessary, but I don't regret it. I would do it again if I had to. The only thing that matters is that you're alive and cancer-free. "I'm coming to pick you up," she said, her voice stronger than it had been since her diagnosis. "You shouldn't be dealing with this alone, and we need to talk through everything together." When my mother arrived at the Starlight Inn, 40 minutes later, I saw her take in the surroundings with an expression of shock and guilt that was painful to witness. The neon signs, the worn exterior, the parking lot full of people whose circumstances had become desperate. It was a far cry from the house I'd owned before her cancer diagnosis. "Marlo, I had no idea. When Venetia said you were staying at a motel temporarily, I thought it was a choice, a way to save money while you figured out your next steps." We sat in her car in the motel parking lot, both of us too emotional to drive anywhere immediately. The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. A careful reconstruction of the past 18 months from a perspective neither of us had understood while living through it. My mother had genuinely believed that her regular insurance was covering most of her treatment costs. Venetia had shown her paperwork indicating that experimental treatments were being approved and paid for through supplemental coverage she'd arranged. The bills that I'd been paying with my own money had been presented as additional expenses not covered by any insurance, necessary costs that were my choice to take on rather than required payments for essential care. "She told me you were being stubborn about accepting help," my mother said, tears streaming down her face. "She said you insisted on paying for extras that weren't medically necessary, that you were emotionally motivated rather than practical about treatment decisions." The manipulation had been expertly crafted, painting me as someone whose emotional attachment to my mother was causing me to make poor financial decisions. Every sacrifice I'd made had been reframed as unnecessary drama. Every hardship I'd faced had been positioned as self-imposed rather than the result of genuine financial pressure. I believed her because she seemed so competent, so organized. She had answers for everything, explanations that made sense, and she was there, present and helpful, while you seemed to be struggling and stressed all the time. I understood why my mother had been more impressed with Venetia's calm competence than with my exhausted dedication. Venetia had been stealing money and using it to fund her appearance of effortless caregiving, while I'd been working 2 jobs and managing medical appointments on 4 hours of sleep a night. I'm so sorry, Marlowe. I should have paid more attention to what was happening with you. I should have questioned why you were facing such financial hardship, while Venetia kept assuring me that everything was under control. The apology helped, but what helped more was the recognition in my mother's voice. For the first time since her diagnosis, she was seeing clearly the extent of what I'd sacrificed and the deception that had made those sacrifices necessary. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We start by getting you away from any of Venetia's ongoing influence," I said. "The detective mentioned that there will probably be civil proceedings to recover the stolen money. That could take months or years, but there's a possibility that some of what I lost can be recovered. The house in Portland, the move I was planning, Venetia arranged all of that. The deposit I put down, the moving company she hired, I need to find out if any of that was legitimate or if it was part of her scheme. The idea that Venetia might have been planning to steal moving expenses as well added another layer of cruelty to her fraud. She'd been encouraging our mother to relocate, not just to be closer to her, but potentially to facilitate additional theft under the guise of helping with relocation costs. "We'll figure it out together," I told her. "But first, I need you to know that I don't blame you for trusting her. She's apparently very good at this kind of manipulation. According to the detective, she's done it to other families before." We drove to my mother's house, where evidence of Venetia's recent presence was everywhere. Boxes packed for the move to Portland, paperwork related to selling the house, financial documents that I now viewed with deep suspicion. My mother and I spent the evening going through everything, trying to determine what was legitimate planning and what might have been preparation for additional fraud. The moving company Venetia had hired charged fees that seemed excessive for the services described. The Portland housing community where my mother was planning to relocate required deposits and application fees that totaled nearly $15,000, money that my mother had already paid based on Venetia's recommendations. Even the timeline for selling the house seemed designed to create urgency that would prevent careful consideration of alternatives. I think she was planning to steal from the house sale too, my mother said, examining contracts that gave Venetia power of attorney over certain financial decisions related to the move. "Look at these papers I signed." She would have been able to access the sale proceeds without my direct involvement. The scope of the planned theft was staggering. Venetia hadn't just been stealing insurance money. She'd been positioning herself to take everything my mother owned while appearing to help her relocate for health and happiness reasons. "Tomorrow we're calling lawyers," I said. "We need to understand your legal options and make sure all of these contracts and arrangements are canceled before any more money disappears." That night, my mother insisted that I stay in my childhood bedroom rather than returning to the motel. Sleeping in the house where I'd grown up, surrounded by furniture and photographs that represented decades of family history, felt like returning to a life I'd thought was permanently lost. But it also felt temporary, uncertain in ways that reminded me how much had been destroyed by Venetia's fraud. Even if we recovered some of the stolen money, even if the civil proceedings were successful, the trust and financial stability I'd built over 20 years of work couldn't be instantly restored. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of legal consultations, paperwork, and gradual revelations about the full extent of Venetia's crimes. The lawyer my mother hired specialized in elder fraud cases and was both competent and encouraging about our chances of recovering at least some of the stolen funds. Cases like this often result in significant restitution, he explained during our first meeting. Your sister will be required to pay back the insurance money she stole, plus penalties and interest. The challenge is that people who commit these kinds of crimes often spend the money quickly, so recovery depends on what assets she still has available. Venetia had apparently been living well on the stolen funds, purchasing a new car, and making improvements to her Portland home that suggested she'd been confident about her ability to avoid consequences. The insurance companies were pursuing criminal charges as well as civil recovery, and other families who'd been victims of similar fraud were filing lawsuits that would likely result in additional penalties. The investigation also revealed that Venetia's 4-month stay in our town hadn't been motivated by family concern. She'd been researching our family's financial situation for months before her arrival, using social media and public records to understand the scope of my mother's medical expenses and my growing financial desperation. She knew exactly how much you were spending and how close you were to financial ruin, Detective Thornfield explained during a follow-up interview. Her timing wasn't coincidental. She arrived when you were most vulnerable and least likely to question additional help. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation was disturbing. Venetia had been targeting families in medical crisis for at least 3 years, perfecting techniques for gaining trust while systematically stealing from people who believed she was helping them. The other victims described similar experiences, financial struggles that seemed insurmountable until a helpful relative or friend arrived to coordinate care, only to discover later that their assistance was actually elaborate theft. Does she feel guilty about any of this? I asked Detective Thornfield during one of our conversations. She maintains that she was legitimately helping your family and that any financial irregularities were mistakes rather than intentional fraud. She claims she planned to repay the money once your mother was recovered and more stable. The denial was almost as painful as the original theft. Even facing criminal charges, Venetia couldn't acknowledge the harm she'd caused or take responsibility for deliberately deceiving people who trusted her during their most vulnerable moments. My mother struggled with grief that was complicated by anger and confusion. She'd lost not just a daughter to criminal behavior, but her understanding of the previous 4 months, the time when she'd believed herself to be loved and supported by both of her children working together. I keep thinking about things she said, ways she positioned herself as the more responsible sister, my mother told me one evening as we went through financial documents. She was so subtle about it, but she kept implying that you were too emotional to make good decisions about my care. The gaslighting had been sophisticated, designed to make both my mother and me doubt my competence and judgment. Every suggestion that I was overspending or being dramatic about financial pressures had been calculated to cover Venetia's theft while making me appear unreliable. She was protecting herself by making me look unstable, I realized. If you thought I was being irrational about money, you wouldn't question her explanations about insurance coverage or treatment costs. 3 weeks after Venetia's arrest, I received a call from the prosecutor's office explaining that she had agreed to a plea deal that would require full restitution plus additional penalties. The recovered funds wouldn't be immediately available, but the legal framework was in place to begin the process of returning the stolen money. How long before I see any of it? I asked. These cases typically take 6 months to 2 years for full resolution, the prosecutor explained, but we may be able to arrange partial payment sooner, particularly for documented hardships like housing instability. The timeline was longer than I'd hoped, but it was something. The possibility of recovering even a portion of what I'd lost felt like a lifeline, a chance to rebuild some version of the financial stability that Venetia's fraud had destroyed. Meanwhile, my living situation had improved dramatically. My mother had canceled her plans to move to Portland and asked me to move back into my childhood home while I figured out longer-term housing. The arrangement was temporary, but it provided stability that allowed me to focus on legal proceedings rather than basic survival. "I want you to stay as long as you need to," she told me one morning over coffee in the kitchen where I'd eaten breakfast as a child. "This house is too big for me alone, and after everything that's happened, I don't want to be far from the people who actually care about me." The simple acknowledgement of my care meant more than any financial recovery could. For the first time since her diagnosis, my mother was seeing clearly the extent of my dedication and the cost of my sacrifices. The recognition I'd never expected to receive was finally being offered, not because I demanded it, but because the truth about Venetia's deception had made it impossible to ignore. The insurance companies were also cooperating with efforts to correct the damage from Venetia's fraud. The supplemental coverage that she'd fraudulently obtained was actually available to our family through legitimate channels, and retroactive applications were being processed to ensure that my mother's future medical care would be properly covered. "You should have qualified for this assistance from the beginning," the insurance representative explained during a phone conference. "Your sister's fraudulent applications actually prevented you from accessing legitimate benefits that were available to you throughout your mother's treatment." The irony was cruel, but not surprising. Venetia hadn't just stolen money that was meant to help our family, she'd actively prevented us from accessing legitimate resources that would have eliminated the financial hardship I'd endured. 2 months after the night I'd received Detective Thornfield's phone call, I was sitting in a lawyer's office, signing paperwork related to the first installment of restitution payments. The amount wasn't enough to replace everything I'd lost, but it was sufficient to begin rebuilding some version of financial stability. "The insurance companies have agreed to expedite processing of your legitimate claims," the lawyer explained. "You should receive approximately $200,000 in restitution within the next 60 days, with additional payments following as the civil case progresses. $200,000 wouldn't buy back my house or restore my retirement account, but it would allow me to rent a decent apartment and start rebuilding credit that had been destroyed by medical debt."
More importantly, it represented acknowledgement that the financial devastation I'd experienced was the result of crime rather than poor planning. "What about my sister?" I asked.
"What kind of sentence is she facing?" "With the plea agreement, probably 3 to 5 years in federal prison, plus supervised release and ongoing restitution requirements. She'll be paying back stolen funds for the next decade at minimum." The sentence felt both adequate and insufficient. 3 to 5 years for systematically destroying multiple families' financial lives seemed light, but the ongoing financial penalties would ensure that Venetia faced consequences for her actions for years beyond her prison term. My mother had been attending therapy to process the complex grief and betrayal she was experiencing. Losing a daughter to criminal behavior was different from losing her to death or distance. More complicated because it required rebuilding her understanding of their entire relationship. I keep thinking about signs I should have seen, she told me one evening, ways she manipulated conversations or deflected questions about financial details, but she was so convincing, so caring in all the ways that mattered to me when I was sick. The therapy was helping her understand that sophisticated fraud was designed to be undetectable to victims, that Venetia's ability to deceive people was the result of practiced techniques rather than our family's gullibility or inattention. The therapist says that people who commit these crimes specifically target families during medical crises because that's when people are too exhausted and overwhelmed to question help when it's offered, my mother explained. 6 months after Venetia's arrest, my life had stabilized in ways that felt both familiar and completely new. I'd rented a small house 10 minutes from my mother's neighborhood, close enough for regular contact but independent enough to rebuild my own identity separate from caregiving responsibilities. The restaurant where I'd been working had promoted me to assistant manager when my schedule became more predictable, and I'd started taking business classes at the community college with the idea of eventually opening my own establishment. The financial recovery wasn't complete, but it was sufficient to start planning for a future that extended beyond simple survival. My mother's health remained excellent, her cancer markers clear, and her energy restored to levels that reminded me of her younger years. She'd joined a support group for families affected by elder fraud, finding purpose in helping other people navigate the legal and emotional challenges of financial abuse. It helps to know that we're not the only family this has happened to, she told me after one of her group meetings, and it feels good to use our experience to help other people understand their options. The legal proceedings continued, with additional charges being filed as prosecutors discovered more victims of Venetia's fraud schemes. The total amount she'd stolen from various families exceeded $800,000, representing dozens of people whose medical crises had been exploited for financial gain. Your sister's case has become a model for how these investigations should be conducted, Detective Thornfield informed me during a final interview. The evidence you helped us gather has been used to prosecute similar cases in 3 other states. The idea that our family's trauma was contributing to justice for other victims provided some meaning to the experience, though it didn't diminish the personal cost of Venetia's betrayal. 1 year after that early morning phone call had changed everything, I was sitting in my own living room, paying bills from my own checking account, planning a modest vacation that I could actually afford. The house was smaller than the one I'd lost to foreclosure, and my financial situation was more precarious than it had been before my mother's diagnosis, but I'd rebuilt enough stability to feel genuinely optimistic about the future. My mother called that evening, as she did most days, to check in and share news about her various activities. She'd become more social since recovering from cancer, joining community groups and volunteer organizations that gave her life structure and purpose beyond medical appointments. I saw Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store today, she told me. She asked about you, said she'd heard you were doing well. I told her about your promotion in the business classes. She seemed impressed. The casual way my mother shared this conversation represented a fundamental change in how she talked about my life. Instead of focusing on my struggles or comparing my situation to Venetia's apparent success, she was acknowledging my accomplishments and expressing pride in my resilience. I've been thinking about something, she continued. When you're ready to open your own restaurant, I'd like to invest in it. Not as a loan, but as a partner. I have money sitting in savings accounts that's not doing anything productive, and I believe in your ability to build something successful. The offer was unexpected and deeply meaningful, representing trust and confidence that had been missing from our relationship during the years when Venetia's manipulation had colored my mother's perception of my capabilities. Are you sure? I asked. Restaurant businesses are risky, especially for someone just starting out. I'm sure, she said firmly. You've already proven that you're willing to sacrifice everything for the people you love. Now, I want to help you build something for yourself. As we talked through the possibilities, I realized that Venetia's fraud had ultimately revealed truths about our family that might have remained hidden otherwise. My mother's understanding of my character and dedication was clearer now than it had been before the crisis, based on evidence that couldn't be manipulated or reframed by someone with hidden agendas. The restaurant we were discussing would be built on honest communication and mutual respect, funded by money that was legitimately ours rather than stolen from insurance companies or other victims. It would represent a future chosen deliberately, rather than one imposed by crisis or deception. 2 weeks later, I received the final restitution payment from Venetia's case, bringing the total recovered funds to just over $300,000. Combined with the insurance coverage that had been retroactively approved for my mother's treatment, our family's financial position was actually stronger than it had been before the cancer diagnosis. It's ironic, my mother observed as we reviewed the financial summaries provided by our lawyer. Venetia's attempt to steal from us ended up exposing resources and assistance programs that we never would have discovered otherwise. The observation was accurate but painful. We'd recovered more than we'd lost in purely financial terms, but the cost in family relationships and emotional trauma was incalculable. Venetia was serving her prison sentence and would remain estranged from our family indefinitely, a loss that grieved my mother, despite understanding the necessity of those boundaries. Do you think you'll ever forgive her? I asked during one of our regular evening conversations. My mother considered the question carefully, as she'd learned to consider most things since discovering how thoroughly she'd been deceived. I think forgiveness is probably necessary for my own peace of mind, she said finally. But forgiveness doesn't mean trust, and it doesn't mean allowing someone back into your life who's proven capable of that level of manipulation. The distinction felt important, a way of processing betrayal that didn't require minimizing its impact or pretending that relationships could return to previous states of innocence. 6 months later, I signed the lease for a small restaurant space downtown, using recovered funds and my mother's investment to begin renovating what would become Meridian Bistro. The name honored the restaurant where I'd worked during my mother's treatment, but also represented a new direction, a deliberate choice to build something positive from the wreckage of our family's crisis. My mother attended the opening night, sitting at a table near the kitchen where she could watch me coordinate the controlled chaos of dinner service. Her pride was visible and unconditional. The recognition I'd spent years hoping to receive finally offered freely and genuinely. "Your grandmother would have loved this," she told me as we closed the restaurant after a successful first evening. "She always said you had the determination to build whatever kind of life you wanted." The comment reminded me that strength and resilience were family traits that existed independent of crisis, qualities that had sustained me through medical emergencies and financial devastation, but also enabled me to create something beautiful when the immediate threats had passed. Standing in my own restaurant, surrounded by evidence of work and planning and careful investment, I felt a peace that had been absent from my life since my mother's diagnosis. Not because the trauma had been erased or the betrayal forgotten, but because I'd learned to build meaning from difficult experiences rather than being defined by them. The phone call that had awakened me in a gas station motel had indeed changed my life, though not in ways I could have anticipated during those first terrifying minutes of conversation with Detective Thornfield. It had led to justice, financial recovery, and ultimately to a deeper understanding of my own capabilities and worth. More importantly, it had revealed that the recognition I'd been seeking from my family was less essential than the respect I'd learned to have for myself, earned through choices made during the darkest periods of our shared crisis, and maintained through the slow work of rebuilding what had been lost.